Welcome everyone to the Michigan Historic Preservation Network monthly webinar. Our topic today is Preserving Yamasaki's Architecture, Celebrating Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Before we get started, I would like to go over some Zoom items. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. And the resources that we want to share with everyone will be sent by chat box. Both of those boxes are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see them, please wiggle your mouse. And please participate in the survey after the webinar concludes. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We advocate for Michigan's historic places to contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We could not do the work we do without our members and volunteers. If you are not a member yet, please consider joining us at www.mhpn.org. And this webinar series is supported in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council. It is my great pleasure today to introduce you our speaker, Dr. Dale Allen Geyer. He's a professor of architecture and chair of the architecture department at Lawrence Technological University. Dr. Geyer's research focuses on 19th and 20th century architecture, particularly the intersections of architecture, education, and society. He has published numerous books and articles to date, including Frank Lloyd Wright's Florida Southern College, the Chicago Schoolhouse, 1856 to 2006, High School Architecture and Educational Reform, Minoru Yamasaki, Humanist Architecture for a Modernist World, and Schoolroom, A Social History of Teaching and Learning. His research endeavors have been supported by awards from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in Fine Arts, the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, and American Philosophical Society. Beyond his research, Dr. Geyer is actively involved in architectural history and historic preservation matters, and has served on the boards of directors of the Society of American Historians, the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, and Docomomo, Michigan, and is a former member of the Michigan Historic Preservation Review Board. He currently chairs the Southfield Historic District Commission. And with that, I will turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Geyer. And Dr. Geyer, please share your screen.
Thank you. And thank you to the Michigan Historic Preservation Network for inviting me to participate. Should be coming up. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And
Yep.
what I will, yes? Okay.
Yes.
What I want to do today is talk a little bit about 5 particular examples of preservation of Yamasaki's architecture, 2 success stories, and 3 kind of in progress stories. And it's good to see a number of familiar names in the audience, including some people I think that perhaps can benefit from our discussion today. And so I want to save as much time as possible for questions and hopefully generate a decent discussion, because I know we have some people here who are involved in at least one of the projects that I'm going to talk about, and perhaps can add more detail on top of what I'm going to say. So I want to start with just a brief overview of Yamasaki's career And please bear with me if you already know this, but if you don't, I think it's kind of important to get a sense of who he was and what he was doing and why preserving his architecture is becoming more of an issue these days. And I will say that hopefully you won't hear any major construction noises, but it's always possible because there is work going on just a few feet away from you right now. So I think we're going to be all right. Okay, so in terms of overview, Minoru Yamasaki was born in Seattle, Washington in 1912 to immigrant Japanese-American parents. He grew up in a situation of extreme poverty and racial prejudice, and he was fighting most of his life against that, and it affected him deeply. I think there are a lot of aspects of Minoru Yamasaki's work that are directly related to his upbringing and the kinds of things that he faced as a young man. And I think it really kind of comes out later in his career in terms of the choices that he made in choosing commissions. And that's all kind of background material that you can learn if you want to pick up my book, or there are a couple other books out there on Yamasaki now. But he eventually became very important. And I'm showing you this image first. He was on the cover of Time magazine in the early 1960s, right around the time that he was named to be the architect for the World Trade Center in New York City, which was a very, very important commission, and in many ways was the peak of his career. And afterwards, he became more famous than ever, but his trajectory changed quite a bit because of the critical response to the World Trade Center. And I'll get into that in a little bit, just a few minutes. But he was born in Seattle. He ended up attending the University of Washington. He graduated with a degree in architecture in 1934 and moved to New York City, where he worked for the next 12 years in a series of large offices, working on various projects, none of which were really outstanding or could put his name on. So he wasn't, in the late 40s, he wasn't really an up-and-coming star architect in the sense that maybe some other people were. But he sort of got out there and people learned about him, and he began to establish a reputation. So much so that in 1945, with no major buildings to his name, Smith, Hinchman and Grills, largest architecture firm in the country and based in Detroit, recruited him to come to Detroit. They wanted to change their design approach. They felt they had been a little too conservative and wanted to become a little more modernist. And for whatever reason, they liked what they saw in Yamasaki's work, and they courted him. And he moved to Detroit to become the head of design at Smith, Hinchman and Grills. And during that time, he began to learn how to work with a bigger office on bigger projects, but he became very frustrated and would eventually leave the firm because they wouldn't let him meet with the clients directly because he wasn't a partner. During that time, though, he begins to produce work that begins to attract attention. So the Federal Reserve Bank Annex in Detroit from 1952 is his first really major work that starts to get some kind of publicity. It was one of the first modernist buildings in Detroit. After he left Smith Hinchman in roughly 1949, 1950, he left with a couple of other employees to form their own partnership. They started a firm that had offices in both St. Louis and Detroit, and Yamasaki was the designer. And so he began this crazy life where he was flying back and forth from St. Louis and Detroit almost on a weekly basis, working on projects in both places. And in those early days, he did a lot of schools, small business buildings, and very much worked in what he called a Miesian mode. He freely admitted that his idol was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And I show you an image of Mies's IIT in the upper left there, which Yama felt was one of his best works and something that Yama kind of strove for, the simplicity of the materials, the clear structural expression, the clear sort of modern focus of the architecture. And so I show you three other photos of Yama in his Miesian mode in the early 1950s, where he is unapologetically making the steel and glass box as interesting as he can. But eventually that wasn't enough for him, and he began to aspire to more, and the firm began to get bigger projects, including things like the Lambert St. Louis Airport in 1951, which eventually would win Yama his first AIA Honor Award, and began to demonstrate him moving in more of an expressionist direction, where he was really keen to explore modern materials and the combination of new structural techniques with modern materials to see what could come of it. And this was a significant commission in the sense that it was really the first major airport in America in the jet age, and kind of set the stage for sort of spectacular type of airport, something that's eye-catching and architecturally significant that a lot of other cities would follow. But at this time, he's also essentially working himself to death. And because of the nature of his practice and all the traveling and all the stress, he develops severe stomach ulcers. And in late 1953, he is forced to have major surgery where they remove 2/3 of his stomach. And he had to take a vacation for the first time. So he decided to take a world tour and see architecture around the world. And it changed his design approach. He went to Japan, he went to India, Italy, the Middle East. He saw Gothic architecture, Islamic architecture, Japanese architecture, and everything in between. And he fell in love with historical architecture from around the world. And he began to think about how he could incorporate some of the techniques that he found in these places that he loved so much into his modern designs. And for the rest of his life, he would talk about the Taj Mahal. It's probably his favorite building. And I think I'm currently trying to explore more aspects of the impact of that trip on his later architecture, because I know he would talk for the rest of his life about the silhouette against the sky and the importance of reflecting pools, and his experience at St. Mark's Piazza in Venice. And he would try to inject all of those into the Miesian mode that he'd been practicing up until that time. So he began to design in the mid-50s a little differently. He began to explore alternative expressions, beginning with the US consulate in Japan, where he tried to merge traditional Japanese and modern architecture. About the same time, he entered the London Embassy competition with a sort of modern Gothic creation that did not win, but did draw him some publicity. And he would eventually go on to generate some more well-known designs and begin to accumulate AIA honor awards and significant amounts of publicity in the architectural world, to the point where he was pretty well respected heading into the 1960s. And all of these buildings are attempts to, as I said, merge that modernist mentality of materials and structure and functional planning with older ideas like beauty and even historical elements. Yama liked to talk about arches and how his colleagues at the time would refuse to use arches when he felt like they were not only appropriate, never had gone out of fashion really, but were more successful in modern materials than they had been in stone back in the old days. So he eventually accumulates enough of a reputation that in early 1960s, when the Port Authority of New York is interested in creating a project in Manhattan for the world's tallest office building, they actually reach out to Yamasaki as one of their invited competitors. There was a small group of people that the Port Authority was considering, and he eventually won that sort of limited competition, designs the World Trade Center. As I said, it's the epitome of his career in many ways. It gets him on the cover of Time and gets him lots of publicity. But the architectural world never loved the World Trade Center and attacked it relentlessly, to the point where his reputation went into serious decline from the mid-60s on. He stopped getting coverage in the major architectural journals and became known in his later career as a skyscraper architect, which he didn't start out to be and did not particularly want to be, but those were sort of the commissions that were left over to him by the clients who sort of saw the good things about the World Trade Center would seek him out as someone who could produce a really good skyscraper for them. And so his career kind of declined in the 70s and into the 80s. He died in 1986, not as a forgotten man, I would say, but as someone whose reputation was severely diminished by the critical response to the World Trade Center. And in terms of his overall architecture, everything he tried to design from the mid-50s on was guided by his philosophy of serenity, surprise, and delight, which is trying to inject those three things into buildings. These are three things that he felt like he learned from the history of world architecture on his travels. And so serenity is about serenity, about trying to find calmness and peacefulness in the middle of a very busy, chaotic modern world. And so the reflecting pools and small gardens that he did are all examples of his attempt to provide peaceful spaces for people to slow down and have a little contact with nature and, get away from the sort of relentless stress of modern urban life. Surprise he really liked as a notion of giving the person who's experiencing the building something unusual, something they don't expect from the outside. So whether it's a wall that surrounds a building, an almost opaque wall that surrounds a transparent building, or his favorite technique was the skylight. You walk into a building, you don't expect it, but suddenly it opens up to a wonderful skylight and the entire room or atrium is flooded with light. Or in a house where you turn the corner and suddenly encounter an entire wall of glass looking out over a garden and a sunken living room. Things that just are unexpected, but additional treats in architecture. Just showing that he was always interested in the experience. He wasn't a theoretician. He was someone who designed for people. And then finally, delight, which was really about beauty. And when I was researching my book, I was struck by how often Yamasaki talked about beauty at a time when other architects refused to even use the word sometimes because they felt it was too tied to the old way of making architecture, and that standards had changed and that there was more beauty in function or in clear expression of structure than there was in the whole package. And Yama felt that the world tour, if anything, taught him that beauty and delight has got to be a part of architecture. It always has been throughout human history and needs to continue being that way. So this is the overall approach that he used in terms of designing his buildings from the beginning to the end, really. And these are the characteristics that made him a very highly regarded architect there for a while in the 50s and 60s. So I want to talk about some specific, cases now in terms of preserving that architecture, to see what has happened and what kinds of issues have come up. And it was really interesting to me because my first impulse was to just talk about the McGregor reflecting pools, which I will talk about, but I had insider experience there and felt like there was a lot of material. But I wanted to branch out and actually learn a little bit more about the preservation of Yama's structures as well. And I realized that there are a lot of Yamasaki buildings that have been preserved and restored and pools and whatnot, but much of it came a few years ago when he still wasn't really that highly regarded. And I think, in my opinion, there's a Yamasaki renaissance that's been happening the last 10 years or so. And I'm not going to claim responsibility for it, but I was part of it, I think. My book came out in 2017. When I started to research that book, I discovered very quickly 2 other people that were working on books on Yamasaki, and they've since published as well. And so there are a number of books out there now. There are articles that are appearing on his work. So the scholarly side of Yama has begun to rise. His reputation is coming back, I think, in academic and architectural circles, but the public has always loved his work. And I think that's going to be a key part of what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. But anyway, there are a lot of projects out there that sort of slipped in maybe 10, 15 years ago when they got no publicity because nobody really cared about Yamasaki back then. I'm going to start with the Century Plaza Hotel in Los Angeles, which was designed and constructed between 1961 and 66. It was part of a larger project called Century City, and that included 2 triangular towers by Yamasaki. But we're going to focus on this wonderful hotel that he designed. It was a kind of a fantastic curved building on a sloping site, 17 stories tall, over 700 rooms. Very, there was much talk when it first opened about the lighting of the entrance and all the lights and the sort of dazzling light bulbs, sort of giving it a very attractive Hollywood kind of feel. There were a number of events that were held in this building, like the Emmy Awards, the Grammy Awards. There was a very public watch party for Apollo 11 when they first walked on the moon. So it was very integrated into the fabric of Los Angeles and its contemporary existence in the 1960s. And it was also very cutting edge for the time when it first opened. It had things like soundproof walls, central air conditioning, built-in vanities, color televisions in the rooms, which was outrageous back then. So it was very much a luxury hotel. It was also a very successful hotel, and the building was well built. And so it goes up in the 60s. It continues on into the 2000s with no major issues. And that's why, in 2008, the architectural world was a bit shocked when a man named Michael Rosenfeld, who was an investor, revealed that he had purchased the hotel and had plans to demolish it. There was nothing wrong with the building, but the idea was that he had been working with the Los Angeles City Planning Department, and in particular, the city councilman who represented Century City. And there were some issues about trying to make the whole area of Century City more walkable. And it was felt that the hotel was sort of in the way and that they could do a better job of circulating people through the site. And so Rosenfeld and his people decided that they were going to tear it down. And the irony was that it had just undergone a $30 million renovation by Hyatt 2 years earlier. And in fact, the plan was to tear it down and replace it with 2 towers, one of which would be a 240-room hotel. So it immediately raised the attention of the architectural and preservation community. But the key was in April of 2009, when Diane Keaton became publicly involved. Diane Keaton, famous actress, but also a very ardent preservationist and architecture lover. And she had actually published a book on photographs of hotel lobbies. So she was particularly interested in this project and had been involved in the Ambassador Hotel controversy in Los Angeles, a failed attempt to preserve a hotel earlier. So this was pretty special for her, I think. And so she held a press conference in April of 2009, across the street from the Century Plaza Hotel, in which she alerted the world that this project was coming and that there was a threat. And as she said, I say here, that all over the city, too many buildings were being torn down, that we need to lead by example. I love this quote, and show the rest of the country that buildings are renewable. We shouldn't just throw them away. We should be recycling them just like we recycle newspapers. And at that press conference, she also announced that the National Trust for Historic Preservation had placed the hotel on the most endangered list, and that the Los Angeles Conservancy had done so as well. The Rosenfeld Company response to this press conference was interesting. They said, quote, "We're disappointed to see the Century Plaza Hotel politicized in this way, particularly at a time when the city of Los Angeles is suffering from extreme economic hardship and is in dire need of new jobs." So the economic argument. And then they threw in, quote, "This is not considered one of the more significant Minoru Yamasaki buildings and is not characteristic of his style," end quote. So even back then, at least some of these more visible buildings, Yama's was kind of a name. He wasn't an anonymous architect. So they're trying to say it's just not one of his better buildings. And I think we've all heard that one before too. Yama, on the other hand, did like it very much and included it in his autobiography with about 30 buildings, little short histories of 30 buildings in there. And this was one of them. Well, the press conference really began to generate some interest, and the LA Times picked up the story, the New York Times picked up the story. There are probably people in the audience who can tell us some more about that, but it seems like that was the key here, getting press coverage, getting public awareness out there. As I mentioned earlier, and I will say again, probably the public loves Yamasaki's architecture. And I think one of the takeaways from this webinar will be that we need to get the word out. If in those situations where Yamasaki building is involved in a potential preservation or demolition or anything, I think we need to get the word out, because if anything, the past has shown us that the public loves his work, appreciates his work, and will protect it. And so in Los Angeles, this momentum grew for saving the hotel, and at some point it turned the heads of those who were trying to demolish it, and they decided to keep it. And so flash forward really fast. In 2015, plans were announced for a new project where the hotel would be saved and the 2 towers would be built behind it, and there would be other changes to Century City. And groundbreaking happened in December 2016. In September 2021, the hotel reopened as part of a $2.5 billion renovation of Century City and reconstruction in Century City. And the hotel was converted from its original 700 rooms. It's now down to 400 guest rooms, 85 suites, and some individual condos as well. And it's also now on the Historic Hotels of America list. So that was one of the first high-profile incidents of a Yamasaki building being preserved. Now, the next one is the one I know the best, and that is the McGregor Memorial Conference Center. And I think there may be some people in the audience who know it as well. This one goes back to just about the same time. It begins with a series of events in late 2009, early 2010, that sort of created this critical mass of interest, I think, in preserving the reflecting pools. The building itself goes back to 1955. It's one of the first generation of buildings that Yamasaki designed after his world tours, after his health issues, when he was starting to put more of his interest in historical architecture and serenity, surprise, and delight into those Miesian boxes he'd been designing earlier. And so the McGregor building ends up being this really kind of wonderful hybrid of classical architecture and Gothic architecture and Japanese architecture and a few touches of other things here and there. And it's really him trying to demonstrate that this modern approach can create something that's beautiful, that's wonderful, that has a sort of historical element to it, but it's not a straight up copy of anything in particular. And one of the main aspects of the design were these reflecting pools that are on the outside of the building. At the time, Yamasaki also was working on a master plan for Wayne State University. And his idea was to try to create a campus that was isolated from the city, and in particular, a campus that would have small pockets, little pocket parks, reflecting pools, grassy spaces with trees, places where you could get away from chaos of everyday life and just sit and relax and think and calm down. And so this is directly tied to serenity, surprise, and delight that he was starting to develop as his main approach. So these reflecting pools are a really important aspect of the entire design. At some point, and nobody ever knows for sure, but at some point a while ago, the reflecting pools were drained because of continual problems with leakage and cracking and freezing. And I've read some newspaper accounts from back in the day when there's some concern for people using the pools to bathe in or splash around in. And so for whatever reason, they ended up being drained and dried for a long, long period of time. In the fall of 2009, an article appeared in the Detroit Free Press written by John Gallagher, which is relaying the story of the chair of the Art and Art History Department at Wayne State, who took it upon herself to try to get some interest in restoring these pools. And she got the university to give her $50,000 in seed money to explore this. So she partnered with the Dean of Engineering and some engineering faculty, and they found some consultants. And in the end, it was estimated back in the fall of 2009 that it would cost $2.5 million to restore these pools, which at the time seemed about insurmountable. But then some other things started to happen, I think, that kind of tied into this. In December of 2009, the Yamasaki firm closed very publicly, at least around the Detroit area. The firm was shut down. There was an auction of materials and a last-minute save of many of the firm's historical archival materials by the Michigan Archives. So that sort of brought the architectural world's attention to Yamasaki again. This was in December of 2009, and that, along with the efforts of these employees, it seems, got the university's attention. And sometime in early 2010, they decided to form a Yamasaki advisory board. About the same time, Yamasaki's children donated their personal materials to the Reuther Library at Wayne State. And so suddenly, in a period of just a few months, there were these two locations with Yamasaki archives. Whereas the previous year, there was nothing. Now, suddenly, there was a great mass of material to look at. And again, it's something that begins to attract more attention to Yamasaki at the time. So the Wayne State University Office of the Vice President for Research decides to fund a Yamasaki advisory board. And it meets for the first time in April of 2010 with a number of representatives from various departments at Wayne State, historical preservationists and historians, former employees, a former partner of Yamasaki, Balthazar Korab, the famous photographer, all sorts of people interested in trying to get some progress on restoring these pools. And at that first meeting in April 2010, we learned, I was a member of that group, we learned that there was a National Register nomination about to come up for hearing in September of 2010. So we set about trying to create ways to raise public awareness about this, because we realized that one of the key aspects of this would be pressure from the outside. And for those of you who are academics, you know that things often work slowly and frustratingly in the academic world. And I think we felt that if we just left it up to Wayne State on their own, it may or may not happen. And so we started to talk about things like a website. We developed a website, which is a clearinghouse for Yamasaki architecture at Wayne State and elsewhere. We instituted a lecture series, which began in late 2010, a series of experts talking about Yamasaki, different aspects of his work. In December of 2010, McGregor was added to the National Register, and I think that really helped, once again, demonstrate to the university the importance of what was going on and what they could do with this if they did it the right way. So by the time we get to the spring of 2011, which is about a year into the formation of the advisory board, there was a report by the vice president for facilities planning and management at Wayne that they had retained Quinn Evans Architects to do a estimate, and that estimate had come back at $1.25 million. And apparently that was a good enough number for the university, and they gave it the go-ahead. And at that point, Quinn Evans began to create their plan, and eventually we learned that there was no way to save those pools. They had to be taken down to nothing and started from scratch because there were too many issues with the technology that was used in the 60s and the replacement work that had been done in the meantime. And so as you can see, there's a little capsule summary here. We did a demolition of the existing shell. They added expansion joints. They had to do a whole new drain system, a whole new circulation system. They had to use all kinds of new materials in the pool itself. We had to look at replacement for the marble chips on the decks. It was very, very complicated and elaborate, but the result was wonderful. Construction began in June of 2012, just a couple of months after the Society of Architectural Historians annual conference had been in Detroit, which again provided more publicity for the project. The project ended in early 2013, and on May 1st, 2013, there was a dedication ceremony for them, which included Yamasaki's daughter and other notables. And so from the time of the first meeting of the Yamasaki Advisory Board to the dedication was 3 years and 1 month. It's pretty quick. And it all sort of came together very, very nicely. And it was a wonderful success. The project won a National Trust for Historic Preservation Honor Award. Quinn Evans won a Governor's Award for Historic Preservation in 2014. And the whole complex, or the building and the pools, were designated a National Historic Landmark in February of 2015. And the overall cost of the project was $1.8 million, a little bit larger than initially expected, but it was largely covered by alumni gifts. And then there was another gift that was established during the process by an alum who wanted to provide for ongoing maintenance. So everything sort of fell into place nicely, and it's a wonderful success story. Not everything is successful, however, and so I want to move to some more current situations, and I don't have as much information, but I know we have at least one person from Seattle in the audience who can maybe fill us in a little bit of this, but I will sketch out the parameters of this project. This is the US Science Pavilion, which was designed by Yamasaki in 1959 for the World's Fair that was held in Seattle in 1962. And the building was sponsored by the United States government, and its purpose was to provide exhibits that showed American dominance in science. This is in the middle of the Cold War, and this is another example of the US showing the Soviet Union, essentially, that we were better than them at science. That was his task. So Yamasaki created this complex of sort of boxy buildings surrounding these reflecting pools. The very famous arches, their sort of visual trademark of this complex, became very well known. I won't flip back, but if you've ever seen the cover of Time magazine that Yama was on, it shows the Science Pavilion in the background, one of the pools. And so it's a project where these reflecting pools are really the heart of the whole thing. It's another courtyard, it's another serenity space, it's another attempt to provide beauty. And particularly in this setting, Yama emphasized how in the World's Fair, it's very, very chaotic. There's lots of people, there's lots to see, and you need a place to just sit down and rest and relax and listen to the sound of water and think about what you're going to do next. And so in this project, the exterior is more important than the interior. After the World's Fair, this became the Pacific Science Center. There were many buildings that were added over time, but the core of it remained the same. There were some sculptures that were added to the pools, but by and large, the overall design is pretty close to what Yamasaki originally imagined it to be. In 2008, the Cultural Landscape Foundation added the Pacific Science Center, as I'll now call it, to their list of the 12 most endangered modernist landscapes, because the city of Seattle's Century 21 master plan had called for the demolition of some of, if not all of this complex, and a sort of restructuring of that particular area where the World's Fair had once been held. And so this raised the attention of the Seattle preservation community to the point where in 2010, it was designated as a city landmark and thereby protected by the Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board. That landmark designation remains in place, which is important because 3 months ago, the Pacific Science Center made a public presentation to the Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board, claiming that the Pacific Science Center's pools are in dangerous condition, that they need extreme renovation, if not replacement, that the equipment was all original from 1962, that there were leaks, nothing had been replaced. So things were corroding, things were damaged. There was leakage of 76,000 gallons of water every day. And according to their estimates, it would cost about $17 million to put this back into working form. And in their presentation, they presented some options in terms of preserving this. And so at the very foundation, what they call the imperative scope, these are the things that absolutely have to be done to fix the aging infrastructure and the leaking pools. But they also went beyond that with 3 other options. The minor enhancement option, and all of these options are focused on these 2 reflecting pools, which are sitting in the middle of the complex. The minor enhancement option, as they call it, involves creating module pots of greenery to place throughout the lower reflecting pool, removing some of the sculptures, upgrading some of the systems, but not doing a whole lot of other work. So it's not an overall rehash. It's sort of a little bit of cosmetic and sort of minimal structural replacement. But they also offered a significant enhancement option. And this is where it starts to get tricky. And with this and the major enhancement option, they are imagining filling in the lower reflecting pool completely and turning it into a meadow, turning it into a place of grass and flowers and plants, and removing the water. And there are all sorts of various issues that they are bringing up in relation to that as well. But they feel like, at a very minimum, the best thing that you can do to preserve one of the pools at least is to turn the other one into a planting. And so that is currently where things stand today. This is not a preservation story as much as it is a preservation alert, because this one has just started. Now, the good news is that, as I said, the Pacific Science Center is protected by the Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board. And so any alterations have to be approved. But we'll see. And I'm hoping that someone in the audience can maybe fill us in on the most recent developments, if there are any, because I've not seen any news on this story in a couple of months. And so this kind of is at the beginning stages. And I think that it will be interesting to see where it goes, because it's a major commission and a major change. And I think that this is another situation where Yamasaki's public face, where his popularity with the public is really going to be important, particularly in Seattle, his hometown, the site of a lot of his major projects, and where there's some very strong preservation protections. Two other things very quickly, and then I want to open it up for questions. One is the Reynolds Metals Regional Sales Office. This is not a preservation success story. Again, it's another alert. This building was designed in 1955 through 59, same time as the McGregor Conference Center. It's sort of Yamasaki continuing his Miesian mode, I would say, but opening it up a little bit, being a little more expressive, but not including the historical elements as much. So no arches, no like historical looking columns, still very kind of high tech for the mid 50s. And the building was a glass box. This is one of my favorite Yamasaki buildings of all time. The transparency was wonderful. I wish I could have seen it in its heyday, but it was, as I said, completely open. You would walk in, the skylight above you, all 3 stories are there, surrounded by a reflecting pool, these wonderful Korab photos that I'm showing you. Very, very important and highly regarded building, another AIA honor award for Yamasaki. At some point in the 1980s, this became a Bally's total fitness health club and remained that way for decades. And the owners changed the building. They extended the first floor walls out to the columns, replaced the transparent glass with black tinted glass, covered over the first floor and put in a swimming pool, removed a 100-seat basement level auditorium. And those were the structural changes. The deterioration of the building, however, has been significant over the last 20 or 30 years. It's been unoccupied for at least 15 years now. It continues to deteriorate every year. There have been a series of owners who have bought the building, talking big things about investment and renovation and whatnot. And in every case, they've done nothing but let it get worse. And so I'm showing you some photos of the interior from about 10 years ago. The walnut wall panel you see on the right is damaged now. There's been significant leakage and freeze-thaw problems inside the building since then, and it's in trouble. The latest word, however, is that the building has been foreclosed upon by Oakland County, Michigan, and is supposed to go to auction in July. The city has the right of first refusal, but they would have to pay the back taxes and the fair market value, and nobody's really sure what that fair market value is. However, Mayor Ken Siver, who's the mayor of Southfield and is known around here as the preservation mayor because he's very interested in historic preservation and leads architectural tours every year. He says there's a potential developer on the horizon who would like to restore it. Unfortunately, I've been hearing that story for 15 years now, so we'll see what happens. I bring this one up because it's my favorite Yamasaki building and because it's in such a derelict state right now, but I don't want to close on a low note. So let's finish with the DeRoy Auditorium. The DeRoy Auditorium, back to Wayne State University, was designed and constructed, that should be 1961 through 64, sorry. It's created in tandem with the building that you see behind it, which was the business building. And it's a very simple auditorium, large auditorium on the main floor, and below is a smaller auditorium surrounded by a reflecting pool, like a little island in its original form. Like the McGregor reflecting pools, at some point decades ago, they were drained and nobody can really put their finger on it. But it's another case of an empty pool on the Wayne State campus. Now, in this case, the success of the McGregor project is definitely spurring some development here. What happened was that during the midst of the McGregor renovation in 2012, the university realized that this was a good thing and it was going to bring them a lot of good publicity. And so they began to talk about and did a study on how to approach the DeRoy reflecting pools. Now it's different because there's a different set of concerns here. There is an underground passage between the two buildings that you see in the top right. And so the reflecting pool leakage drainage problems could have more effects than over at McGregor. But they undertook a study in 2012 They updated that study in 2018 and seemed like they were ready to make a move, but then COVID hit, everything was postponed. But the good news is that a couple of months ago, the university had announced that their board had approved a multi-phase project to restore the reflecting pools at De Roy. The first phase, which they hope to complete by the end of this summer, last I heard by the end of July, but I don't know if that's still the target, was to redo the reflecting pools and the 2 pedestrian bridges that connect the building to the mainland, if you will. The next phase would be redoing the plaza and steps and the landscaping and a little bit of interior work. And then finally, a third phase would involve redoing or renovating the building itself. But the good news is that this is on target as far as I know, and that we're hoping that by the end of this summer, we're going to have another wonderful reflecting pool at Wayne State University for Yamasaki lovers and just for students and faculty and visitors to enjoy. So that's kind of 5 examples of various stages of Yamasaki architecture and some of the issues surrounding them. I was hoping that I would be able to tie this all up with some wonderful words of wisdom, but I really don't have any other than that it seems to be publicity. That's the key. Yama is liked, and it's unlike some other maybe famous architects. I mentioned Mies van der Rohe, even Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, there are members of the public who just don't care for their architecture, but Yama, for some reason, really is attractive to people. They like his stuff. They always have, even back when the critics were attacking him. And I think that at least the success stories here demonstrate that public opinion is crucial here. I think the Los Angeles story, perhaps without Diane Keaton's star power and the publicity surrounding that, maybe isn't as successful. Here at Michigan at the McGregor schools, there was so much happening that sort of directed attention to Yamasaki at the same time during the 2009-2010 period that the university was kind of forced to maybe reevaluate their previous position. If so many people were telling them that they wanted this to happen, that they wanted something good to happen to Yama's architecture, that seemed to get through to them. And so I guess the takeaway is get out there and get the word out. Let people know, because people will care about Yamasaki's architecture and will help out. Okay, that's enough for me. Let's talk about this. And I'd love to hear from those of you who maybe are involved in some of these projects or previous projects.
Yeah, so Dr. Geyer, actually we have folks from Seattle who would like to communicate with you. So I can actually open.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Or you can leave it on, that doesn't matter.
Okay.
See, I will bring them up so they can comment. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I loved all the information. We've obviously been looking a lot into Yamasaki and his legacy these past few months as we've been looking into our courtyard renewal project. And I really just wanted to say that we don't have my name is Machen Petrie. I'm the VP of Finance and Operations at the Pacific Science Center. And we're the project, if you actually went back a couple slides, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so we are figuring out how we can restore and preserve these courtyards. And we are still really early in these stages. So what we gave to the Landmarks Board was just a briefing saying, we know that there's work that needs to be done. We care so much about Yamasaki and his legacy and want to preserve these courtyards. We want to find a way to do that that's sustainable for us both, financially and ecologically sustainable,
Mm-hmm.
and in a way that really brings in guests who maybe historically have not felt like they were included in this space. And you talk so beautifully about Yamasaki and how he did not feel included in Seattle, and really his architecture is a reflection of him wanting to have an inclusive space. So we're really right now just building our community engagement and feedback to figure out how we can make this space not only preserve his legacy, but also feel really inclusive for folks who may not have had space there previously. So that's where we're at right now. So if anyone on this call is interested in hearing more about our project, we would love to engage and talk more about it.
And I would say one of the things that you all have done, or that I'm not sure who organized it or how it happened, but I know that very quickly after this presentation in February, when the story broke, I was contacted along with other people to provide a letter. Like in addition to sort of general public uproar, it seemed like in this case, very quickly, the call went out to experts to weigh in. And Dokomomo and myself and some other people who've written about Yamasaki, we all sent letters in. That was not part of the McGregor situation. McGregor was, I feel like, very local in many ways, whereas this one instantly went national.
Yeah.
And I think that's good and important. And the other thing you said, I think, is really important. This is his hometown, and like he'd never felt accepted there. He had bad memories about his Seattle experiences, even though he wanted, I mean, he sort of had a love-hate relationship. He loved the city and the scenery, but his upbringing was so traumatic that it was tough. And so like, he really tried to do good things when he designed in Seattle. This, I think, was very successful. I'm not a fan of the Rainier Bank Tower, but I think he was trying to do something more unusual than he normally would for the city because it was his city, and he was almost striving for acceptance of his own designs. I almost included the new building that went up right next to the Rainier Tower. Just, it's not really a preservation issue, but I'm personally kind of offended by that project. And if you guys know, in Seattle, they put up a new building right next to Yama's building and then kind of stepped it back so it wouldn't block it. And don't get me started on that. But going back to the original points, yes, I think part of what I was hoping for this and for my including this in it was to sort of raise a discussion with other people and just let them know, whoever's on the call, like if there's ways that you can help, please get involved. I think this is a little bit of a different case because there are some protections here, but the costs, I think, are just so really outrageous to keep it as pools, I think, which is the goal, I think is really going to require some big money to come in.
Yes. And I would say, echo your point about, I love that this has spread out outside of the local community, that we're getting so many preservationist voices coming in from all over. It really speaks to Yamasaki's legacy. I would love for us to be able to have a dialogue about it. I think we got a lot of comments right out the gate when the news broke. And we just want the opportunity to, tell our story and have a conversation back and forth about it, be curious about the process behind it, and just know that we really do care about preserving it, and that anything that we do, any additions that we have, our plan is to have them be fully reversible. And we're still super early stage. So I just welcome continual dialogue, and I'm so glad that you all put this presentation together to highlight his work.
Thank you so much for your comments. And Eugenia, would you like to say a few things before we move on to other questions?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Dale. We met years ago when you were visiting Seattle, researching Yama's work. This is a great presentation. And as I mentioned in the Q&A, that Historic Seattle and Dokomomo, we've been helping lead advocacy efforts to to preserve the pools, the Pacific Science Center, because as you say, it's the landmark is well loved by many. And Pacific Science Center has been a really good steward, since the World's Fair, and we'd love to see that stewardship continue. We appreciate it that they came to us early to share this with us. But quite frankly, we were really shocked by what we foreseen. So we felt like we really had to get the word out there, and because we know people would want to know about this. And we shared the timing of this program was great, because then we shared it with the landmark staff, the landmarks board, and with Pacific Science Center and their design team. And so and I had mentioned to them about Wayne State's project, and I've been to Detroit, and I made a pilgrimage to Wayne State just specifically to see Yama's work. And this was a year after the McGregor pool was restored, and I was just blown away. And so having seen this and knowing that was possible, I wanted to connect all of you with those of us here, so that we can learn from other projects and successful projects and how it can be done. And that we believe that there can be successful fundraising for restoration and not drastically changing the pools. That we understand that systems and things like that fail. It's over 60 years old now, and those can be replaced. And dealing with a more environmentally friendly solutions and all of that is really important. So happy to continue the dialogue. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And it's good to hear from you again. And I should mention that I skimmed over the Science Center's proposals, but in there, in addition to the pods or the meadow, the more extensive proposal also includes removing some of the viewing decks. And so there's a major alteration to this lower reflecting pool. And I'll say that I feel, I'm not an insider on this one, but I feel like it seems like they have legitimate concerns. I just wonder why it took them 60 years to bring them up. If this is the same equipment from 1962, I'm sure it didn't just go bad in the last couple of years. Couldn't something have been done earlier? But we'll
can I make a quick comment about the walking? So that's not original. So we're actually, us taking that out is for us to restore it to its original state.
And
yes.
And there are a lot of sculptures that have been added in the water, and that's part of the project too, is to remove those. Even at I think the minimal intervention proposals are talking about removing some of those sculptures that were added.
Yes, yeah. So a lot of it, I would say the bulk of the project is restoration. It's removing walking pads, removing other items, restoring the terrazzo, restoring the pools themselves, getting them up to speed. And then we're trying to figure out, is there a way that we could introduce life into the pools? Like so many of Yamasaki's works have had, is this respite from the city that show plant life and living things in the middle of a cityscape is something that we were really trying to find a way to do that it maintains the original structure and is, like I said, going to be removable, was really one of our goals, and allows us to be more environmentally sustainable as well.
And I'm wondering if there maybe are some connections to be made just among the reflecting pool projects, because in addition to McGregor, before McGregor, Yama did a building in Minneapolis, which was originally the Northwestern National Life Insurance Company. And it's the temple down at the lower left here. Has reflecting pools surrounding it. And they've been restored at least once, if not twice, before McGregor even began. As far as I know, this is one of those sort of low-key preservation projects that I couldn't find a lot of information about, but there's been a lot of work on that building in Minneapolis. And so, like, as you would imagine, the reflecting pools are an issue. And it seems like it would make sense to maybe get a group together to talk to each other about their experiences.
Yes, we'd love to hear from others.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you both for commenting. And I know we're over, but I want to remind everybody that this webinar is recorded. It will be available on our website afterwards, maybe later this week. So, and you will receive an email when it is available. So Dr. Geyer, if that's okay, maybe we can go over a few questions.
Sure.
Okay, so from Gary Wilson, he said that I was a student at Grant Elementary School in Livonia in the 1960s. So he has two questions. First, I will read them, just you can answer them one by one. First, how recognized is the school as an example of Yamasaki's late work among Yamasaki scholars and within the school's local community?
I would say not at all. One of the interesting things that I discovered when I started researching him was that he had done so many schools in the 1950s, early 1950s, which was very interesting to me because that's kind of my specialty, educational architecture in general, and particularly sort of 20th century school development. And I was very surprised to learn that he designed so many schools throughout Michigan during that time and was very highly regarded. He was winning awards. There was a group of school designers in the 50s and 60s, firms that were sort of go-to firms and that kept popping up in the major journals for their work. And he could have been one of those people if he had decided to stay with schools. But he got out of them pretty fast. It's interesting, his early career was mainly houses and schools. And he dropped them both as quickly as he could. I don't know why schools, probably moving on to bigger and better projects, but I know that he didn't like doing houses because he didn't like the constant, well, how do you want to call it, interaction with the client. He said, like, if you have a corporate client, you work out the details and you go off and start to design. If you have designing for a house for someone, they're looking over your shoulder and they're constantly making you change things, and he didn't want that. So I think that even today, it's very little known that he did these schools, and certainly I live in Farmington Hills, and I used to live in Livonia, and there's like no recognition whatsoever that Yamasaki had anything to do with any of these school buildings.
Okay, so the next question is related. Is there any organized initiative to ensure the preservation of the school buildings?
No, there's not. And unfortunately, schools just are it's tough to save a school unless it's really famous, and there aren't that many of those, or by a really famous architect. They're already going to have been changed over the years anyway. You won't find an original 50s or 60s school anywhere. They've been renovated and refurbished and updated so many times that in some cases, there's hardly anything original left. But it's always so much about money that schools don't have the luxury of preserving and protecting buildings. In most cases now, they're actually, where population ebbs and flows, and it's ebbing. And we have these, in higher education, we get these horror stories about how the population of 18-year-olds is declining rapidly in the near future, and that's going to lead to more school closings. So it's not a good future.
Okay, next question. Do you know approximately how many buildings were designed by Yamasaki?
Oh my, not offhand. A lot, couple hundred, I would say, minimum. Okay. I have a master list. If you want to send me an email, I could probably do some quick calculations.
So do you think they're all are all the buildings by Yamasaki known throughout the world, or are there additional ones surfacing all the time?
There are additional ones surfacing. I was contacted just a couple of years ago by someone in a small community nearby where I live that they had sort of found this little pharmacy that he designed. Kind of tiny little building on a corner lot. It's sort of triangular, like totally throwaway, but somebody dug in and found that he designed it. I also have the master list, as I said, and there are numerous projects that aren't identified like by an address, but residence for somebody, and there's a name. And so I'm trying to track some of those down. I think that there are quite a few houses that we still haven't identified in this area that he designed. But there are also a lot of people who like to claim they have Yamasaki houses that were not actually designed by him. So it's interesting.
Okay. Okay, next question. Like Frank Lloyd Wright had followers and still does. Who were those influenced by Yamasaki's work?
Boy, that's a great question. I think it's not so easy to see in the sense that, like Frank Lloyd Wright, there are the straight out copiers, there are the sort of Frank Lloyd Wright light designers. You can always kind of see the Wright in there, maybe. I don't know if on a national scale there's an influence in the sense of other than copying, I would say. It's particularly interesting around the Detroit area, where I'm finding more and more just sort of generic office buildings in small communities that you look at it and you could tell it's a version of this temple building that I'm showing you, or it's a version of another famous building by Yamasaki, but on a reduced scale. I think he had a real impact on local architects in that sense, but he also trained a lot of architects, and that's where his real influence came from. And I think it doesn't come out in the work of these architects looking like his so much as it is the notion of serenity, surprise, and delight that he instilled in them, and they went off and did their own practice or work for others. Mm-hmm. One of the more interesting things I found was that he and Eero Saarinen sort of exchanged employees quite a bit. And there was a lot of folks who would work for one, then work for the other, and then go off and do their own thing. And some of them ended up being famous. Like Robert Venturi worked for Saarinen at one point. Gunnar Burkertz worked for Saarinen and then worked for Yamasaki. Others kind of less well-known, but regionally pretty well-known, went through those offices. And so I think his influence was more in terms of approach than in the work that they produced.
Okay, and one audience said, there used to be a model of the former trade center in his former office in Troy. Does anyone know what happened to that model?
The missing model. Yes, this comes up every year. In fact, I just talked to someone about this a few months ago. So when he designed the World Trade Center, this is kind of fun. Apparently they went through like 110 different schemes. And people in the office says they pretty much got it at about number 20, but then they just kept going to make sure they didn't miss anything. But there were models associated with these. And when they finally finished on the Twin Towers, settled on the Twin Towers scheme, they created these wonderful models. And there appear to have been more than one, although we're not sure. There are lots of stories that my university owned one. And I have scoured every square inch of my university and talked to everyone who was around before 1980, and they know nothing. The only model that I'm aware of is at the Skyscraper Museum in New York City. And that may be the one that everyone is talking about. Maybe it moved around, but this is interesting because it keeps coming up.
Okay, yeah, we still have a lot of questions that we didn't cover, but we are running out of time. Maybe can answer one more. And yeah, if anybody has any questions afterwards, I can certainly pass it on to Dr. Geyer, and we can get those questions answered. So the last one. In 2015, Detroit was named by UNESCO as the first city of design in the United States. Are we doing enough with our Yamasaki legacy in light of what we should be expecting of ourselves and other architects too?
That's very interesting. And I guess I'd never really thought of it before, but I don't feel that like the Yamasaki legacy is tied into the UNESCO designation at all. And it's a missed opportunity, because if you look at Detroit architecture and big names and famous buildings, Yamasaki stands out in the city of Detroit. He's got 4 buildings at Wayne State. He's got 2 or 3 other buildings in the city, and there's no other high profile architect who can say that. And so in a way, it's not his city, but he's sort of the most famous architect who has recognizable work in the city. And I don't feel like that's touched on at all. And frankly, the whole UNESCO designation I thought was fascinating, but it all seems to be contemporary and forward-looking to me, and there doesn't seem to be that much of a historical aspect to it, which I'm a little disappointed about. I don't know if that actually answers your question, but touches on it a little.
Yeah, okay, so I apologize we couldn't cover all the questions, but we have to conclude this webinar. And Dr. Geyer, thank you so much for your time, giving us this wonderful presentation. And everybody, I can feel, I can see from the questions, they all enjoyed it so much. And so again, this webinar is being recorded. You will receive the link of the recording in a couple of days. And please participate in the survey. That survey link will be in the same email. And thank you everybody for participating today. And our next webinar is scheduled for June 29th. And the topic is Hauling in the Net, the creation and conservation of Zoltan Zepshi's WPA mural on Beaver Island. And thank you everybody for your time today, and I hope to see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you.